Hello friends, welcome to Autumn at St. Andrew. It is my privilege to welcome you here today from the beautiful St. Andrew Sanctuary. I am grateful as always to share this sacred online space with you, where we are all invited, included, and valued as vital and beloved members of our broader worshiping community. St. Andrew is proud to be an open, affirming, inclusive congregation that welcomes all people into the full life and communion of our church. This includes saints and sinners, believers and skeptics, the lost and the found, the wanderers and the wanderers, families of all shapes and sizes, and people from every point along life's journey. No matter who you are or where you've been, no matter what you believe or even if you believe anything at all, you are welcome here and you belong here. If you have any questions about our church, prayer requests for our care team, or if you would like to get in touch with a member of our pastoral team or staff, please email info@gostandrew.com. If you would like to explore deeper engagement with the St. Andrew community through our many classes, group life gatherings, and service opportunities, you can email us directly at connect@gostandrew.com. We would love to hear from you. Just as a reminder, our full Sunday morning worship services, complete with music, prayer, announcements, liturgy, ministry spotlights, and the sermon, are live streamed on our YouTube page each week and permanently archived for viewing anytime. Lastly, to contribute a financial gift to the work and ministry of St. Andrew, you can always visit gostandrew.com/give or text St. Andrew to 28950. And now let's listen together to this week's scripture and sermon.
Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadows of death, I fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Have you ever had one of those awkward moments when you're giving an important speech or a presentation at work or school and you inadvertently commit a so-called slip of the tongue? It's like you're thinking so fast your tongue can't quite catch up to your brain, and before you know it, you reverse or transpose a few letters or syllables, and you say something super embarrassing or illogical. A crushing blow becomes a blushing crow, or a bad salad becomes a sad ballad. A party animal becomes an arty panimal, or a bear hug, a hair bug. These weird slips of the tongue are called spoonerisms, named after an Anglican priest, William Archibald Spooner, who about 100 years ago became famous not for what he said, but for the way he often said what he said. Spoon and fork became foon and spork. Let me show you to your seats became let me sew you to your sheets. I have a half-formed wish in my mind became I have a half-warmed fish in my mind. They're called spoonerisms. You can look it up. And Spooner's most famous one came about when, while preaching about God, he meant to say the Lord is a loving shepherd, but what came out of his mouth instead was the Lord is a shoving leopard. You can Google it. It really happened. When you think about God, do you envision God as more like a loving shepherd or a shoving leopard? The 23rd Psalm begins with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd." It's one of the most well-known and treasured passages in all of Scripture, right up there with, "For God so loved the world," and "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper and not to harm you." The Lord is my shepherd. I've read the 23rd Psalm literally hundreds of times in personal devotions, in worship, at funerals. It's healing and comforting power for those who are going through grief or crisis. It's almost universal. It wasn't until this week, as I began to prepare this message, that I remembered quite unexpectedly that the words of the 23rd Psalm were the very last words I spoke to my father before he died. I do not mean here to sound super religious or spiritually pretentious. In fact, I hadn't actually intended those words to be the last words that I would ever speak to my dad. In fact, the day before my dad died, I was pretty sure I had already said everything I wanted and needed to say while he was still awake and responsive. But by the following afternoon, after he'd slipped into unconsciousness and his vitals began to decline, it was clear that the end was now very near. And that was when the nurse, after listening to the slowing drumbeat of his heart, gave me that knowing glance and said, to my surprise, "Come speak words of comfort to your dad. He can still hear you. There's not much time." Then she left the room, and it was just the two of us. And I didn't know what to say to my father that I hadn't already said, and I wasn't even sure he needed or wanted to hear me say anything at all. But now he was slipping away, and time was running out, and the nurse's suggestion caused sudden concern and worry for me, that if my father could still hear me and I didn't say anything, I might somehow disappoint or sadden or upset him. Have you ever noticed how grief and death can play all kinds of crazy mind games on us in moments like that? So I could feel myself in that moment starting to panic, grasping for something, anything meaningful to say, and coming up empty. When all at once the words of Psalm 23, it just seemed to speak themselves into the room, all on their own, into that sad and tender moment. It was as if the words of the psalm came from some mysterious place inside of me that I didn't even know existed. From beyond the place in the mind where rote memorization resides. From some almost distant ancient memory that had been a part of me before I had ever even become a part of this world. This wisdom handed down from generation to generation over thousands of years, recited and sung and prayed around the campfires of our ancestors and sages. The psalm seemed to speak by the power of its own deep longing to be heard. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. In that moment, all at once, the words of Psalm 23 transported both of us from that little hospital room to green pastures and grassy meadows, where we rested together in silence one last time. It led us to still, peaceful waters, where we waded in the stream of grace and forgiveness for all that had stood between us. It led us down paths of righteousness, restoring our souls for what was about to come next. When at last we arrived at the valley of the shadow of death, that valley that no one ever wants to walk through, but that we all someday will walk through. And it was there that the psalm, all on its own, whispered its next line to help both of us believe what was so hard to believe, but what we longed to believe in that moment. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I share this story with you only because What I learned in that moment and what I have come to understand more fully as I walk this journey of faith is that I cannot walk without a shepherd, and I cannot live without a flock. And what makes Psalm 23 so powerful and timeless and resonant is that it speaks of a God who is above all things a loving shepherd. And it speaks of you and me as something like sheep in that shepherd's flock. Now, this is both comforting and disturbing news all at once, by the way. Because honestly, does anyone really want to be a sheep? In our minds, sheep are sheepish, skitterish, overeating, ever-bleeding, cud-chewing, prairie-dwelling, these creatures that have no apparent purpose in the world. We assume this because maybe we've hung out at a few petting zoos and we think we know better. But most of us haven't spent much time with real sheep. Most of us don't know the real truth about them. And even if we did, we probably still wouldn't appreciate being compared to one. But why is this comparison so fair and accurate? Because sheep are mostly vulnerable, sensitive, needy creatures, especially when they're on their own. Without a leader, sheep are prone to wander aimlessly, and they will happily follow just about any leader anywhere, even into danger, just to belong. In other words, sheep are high-trust individuals, but despite their remarkable intelligence, they're not particularly street smart. And what's worse, sheep have no defense against predators whatsoever, except for flocking. But it turns out that their instinctive flight response to predators also causes them to panic and scatter from their flock even more. Imagine that. When they're scared, they run away from the one and only thing that can save and protect them, their flock, their community. And when they get separated from their flock, sheep tend to freak out and get highly stressed. If they can't see their sheep mates when they're grazing, they tend to grow agitated and anxious. And the loss of that visual contact leads to further panic and scattering. So just keeping a flock of sheep all together and all at peace in one place, that's kind of a miracle, given how nutty and uptight and suspicious they can be. Now that you know a little more about sheep, how does it feel to think of yourself as one of them? It actually, I think, describes us humans pretty accurately when you think about it. We, like sheep, are highly vulnerable creatures, especially when we're alone. We are prone at times to wander aimlessly. We will often follow any leader, even dangerous ones. We stress out a lot. We get highly agitated. We freak out at times, and we scatter so easily. And we long desperately to belong to a flock, even as we pretend that we can live without one. Maybe this is why Psalm 23 resonates so deeply with us moderns. It names what so many of us lack, what so many hunger for but don't even know it. The very thing we need the most, but the one thing we've somehow convinced ourselves we can live without. A flock, a community, a collection of people, however imperfect, to whom we belong and through whom we find shelter and sanctuary in this big world that seems more and more to be marching headlong into the valley of the shadow of death. We try to journey alone, and so in the modern world, we live in fear and suspicion and stress and danger and even hopelessness. The writer of Psalm 23 understands that he is not alone and that he cannot live or journey alone through this world. Not only does he have a shepherd, a deeply loving shepherd to guide him, but he also belongs to a flock of other sheep who, like him, are all trying to follow that shepherd together through all those valleys of shadows. Some scholars believe that the writer of Psalm 23 is actually in the valley of the shadow of death himself as he writes this psalm. Some argue that he's somewhere in the temple in Jerusalem writing these timeless words while the temple is under siege by invading armies and enemies that threaten death. Other scholars suggest that maybe he's going through a personal valley of shadows as he composes his psalm. Maybe it's a crisis of faith or deep disillusionment about the state of the world. Maybe a doctor just left the room after a devastating diagnosis. Maybe his child is in deep trouble and he doesn't know what to do. Maybe his marriage is broken, or his heart is broken, or his mind is broken. Whatever it is, he's feeling pretty sheepish as he walks through the valley of the shadow. He's feeling vulnerable, and he knows that he cannot in this moment separate himself from his flock or from his shepherd. Maybe he's a lot like so many people I've talked to lately who look at the world and see that valley of the shadow just growing deeper and darker and wider. Maybe they're feeling like him, super vulnerable. Bloody conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. Thousands of innocent lives lost to senseless terror and indiscriminate retaliation. Swells of migrants and refugees at our borders, all of whom are fleeing global violence. A federal government that refuses to govern, another mass shooting, and more people trying to get through the valley of the shadows alone. In a recent podcast interview, I was asked why anyone today would still want to go to church, given, how so many churches are so broken, and how so many broken churches are breaking so many good people with toxic Christianity and hypocrisy. I told the interviewer that no one should ever go to a broken church, and that if your church is breaking you, you should find another one. Because there are still some churches in the world that are healing people and healing the world. And the kind of church the world needs today, right now, is not a perfect church, but a flock of vulnerable yet faithful sheep who are all just trying to follow the loving shepherd who promises to show them how to love and care for each other and how to heal the world. When churches do the work of the flock really well and faithfully, those churches, I believe, might still be our best hope, maybe even our last hope, for helping people and helping this world get through the valley of the shadow of death. It's no secret, more people today, more than ever, are trying to live without a flock like that. And not only do they suffer for it, but I believe the whole world suffers too. The shadows in the valley always grow darker when the sheep scatter. So many are asking, why would anyone want to be a part of a flock called church? And maybe the simple answer is to become the light of the world for the valleys of the shadows. Isn't that why Jesus called his followers the light of the world? That's why I can't live without a flock and a loving shepherd to lead it. Apart from that light of Christ that's kindled in community, our souls and the soul of the world grow darker, not lighter. If we have never heard the ancient prophets railing against injustice, we will never really know how to resist evil and oppression and violence and racism and hatred in the world. And then the shadows in us and around us will just grow darker. If we have never heard the words of Christ who said, I was naked and it was me whom you clothed, and hungry and it was me whom you fed. I was sick and it was me whom you cared for. If we have never heard those words, we will never fully know how to respond with compassion to the needs of the poor and the downbeaten and the overlooked and the forgotten ones. And then the shadows in us and the world will just grow darker. If we've never heard the promises of a loving shepherd who says, you are forgiven, and you are accepted, and you're healed, how can we ever endure the personal setbacks and hardships and blow-ups and screw-ups that will inevitably come to every life? If we don't hear those words, the shadows only grow darker. And if we have never once heard the radical teachings of Jesus, who says, you got to love those who hate you and forgive the one who has hurt you and pray for your enemy, how can we ever make real, lasting peace in ourselves and in our relationships or even in the world? The shadows always grow darker, and the valleys only grow more impassable when the sheep scatter. But the good news of the psalm is that the light grows brighter for all of us whenever sheep still gather and still dare to follow this loving shepherd right into the dark valleys of this world. This is the ancient wisdom of the psalm. This wisdom that is handed down from generation to generation over thousands of years, and it continues to speak today. Sometimes only by the sheer power of its own deep longing to be heard. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord, it's our shepherd. In the valley of the shadow, we have nothing to fear. If, of course, only we can remember that we are like sheep who simply cannot live without each other. Takeaways for today: the Lord is a loving shepherd. The shadows in the valley always grow darker when the sheep scatter. The light always grows brighter when the sheep stay together.